So for folks filing in, we're going to get started in just a moment. We're letting more people enter the Zoom room, so just stay with us.
Okay, I think maybe we'll go ahead and get started, and hopefully more people will start to continue to come in as we start our introductions. So good morning, and for those of our guests who are overseas, good evening, and welcome to the 5th session of our 8-part series entitled Israel, Palestine, where we are, what comes next, and why it matters to Congress. I'm Khalid El-Gindi. I'm director of the program for Palestine and Palestinian Israeli Affairs at the Middle East Institute, and I'm pleased to co-host this series with my colleague Lara Friedman, president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace.
Thanks, Khalid. Today's session is Palestinian refugees and the role of UNRWA. To dig into these issues, we have with us today another outstanding panel of experts. I'm going to introduce them very briefly in alphabetical order, starting with Diba, and I know I'm going to get your last name wrong, Abu Nejila. Am I close? Diba is a Palestine refugee from Gaza, and she's coming to us directly from Gaza. And she has worked for 10 years with UNRWA in Gaza, working on gender neutrality and protection. And she is one of the first female UNRWA area chiefs in Gaza. Second, we have George Washington University professor and author Ilana Feldman. Ilana is Vice Dean of the Elliott School of International Affairs and Professor of Anthropology, History, and International Affairs at GW University. Her research is focused on the Palestinian experience, both inside and outside of historic Palestine, examining practices of government, humanitarianism, policing, displacement, and citizenship. And last, we have Gwyn Lewis. Gwyn is the director of UNRWA operations in the West Bank and leads all programmatic and operational components of UNRWA operations throughout the West Bank. She has been involved in humanitarian and development work for almost 20 years. She worked previously as deputy director for programs in UNRWA Lebanon, and before that worked with UNICEF's emergency division, with FAO, with OCHA, and with the ICRC. You can read our guests' full bios at the FMEP website. Our colleagues will put links to that into the chat. And also watch the chat box for Twitter handles for our guests and links to articles and other resources as they become relevant in today's discussion. And if you miss anything in the chat box, don't worry. All the materials there will be posted on the website along with a video of this webinar.
So the format for today's panel is going to be a moderated Q&A led by Lara and me. We're going to put some basic questions to our panelists, but we very much welcome your questions as well from our audience. You can submit your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window, and you can submit them at any time, and Lara and I will try to incorporate them as seamlessly as we can into the conversation. So we'll keep an eye on those. Finally, please note that this webinar is being recorded. And if you're having any technical problems during today's session, you can submit questions into the chat box. And with that, let's go ahead and get started.
Great. So we're going to do a first round, which I'm calling setting the scene. So effectively, the fate and claims of Palestine refugees are a core issue in the Israel-Palestine conflict. Indeed, it is one of the special, quote, permanent status issues that under the Oslo Accords is supposed to be decided in the context of permanent, sorry, we're having a fire alarm at my house. Just a drill, so just ignore the loud noise. Permanent status issues that under Oslo Accords are supposed to be decided in the context of permanent status talks between Israelis and Palestinians. So, Ilana, starting with you. Who are the Palestinian refugees? How did this population come into being? Why has the situation of these refugees remained unresolved for so long? And meaning that now we have multiple generations of Palestine refugees on the ground and around the world.
Thank you, Laura, and thanks to both Laura and Khaled for convening this conversation today. So, I will try in just a few minutes to address this very multi-layered question, starting with probably the shortest answer and then maybe expanding out from there. The Palestine refugees are the inhabitants and the descendants of the native inhabitants of Palestine who were displaced in 1948. About 750,000 Palestinians became refugees in 1948. But then to fully understand what this population is, how it came about, and why people continue to be refugees, I think we need to look before 1948, during 1948, and after 1948. And again, I'll try to do that very briefly. Before 1948, and basically starting from at the end of World War I, when the former territories of the Ottoman Empire were kind of divided into mandates governed, designed to be temporary by European powers, Britain and France, the lands of the Middle East were all classified as what were known as Class A mandates. That is, territories where the populations were very by European powers to be very close to capacity for self-governance and independence. And the mandate powers were meant to shepherd them towards that. And eventually all of the countries around Palestine became independent, not without struggle on the part of their inhabitants. Palestine was a Class A mandate, but from the beginning was different than the other mandates in that the mandate was structured not primarily to support the development of the native population's self-governance and independence, but was designed to promote and support the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine, which meant supporting incoming migrant settlers to Palestine and supporting the development of that territory towards a Jewish national home, while at the same time protecting the civil and religious rights of the native inhabitants. So it's very important to note that the mandate itself was never equal in its protections to these different communities. But also even in that inequality, it was impossible to actually protect the civil and religious rights of the native population while promoting a settler colonial population. So the years of the mandate were a period of multiple and ongoing kind of conflict between settler populations and British governing authorities, between native populations and British governing authorities, and among the people living in Palestine. So in 1948, essentially Britain gave up on the mandate and turned the problem over to the United Nations, which decided to partition the territory. Again, the territory that was largely inhabited by a native population, and the UN voted for a kind of division of the territory into two separate states, one for the native population, one for the Jewish settler community. Which led to conflict that began before the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. And in the course of that war, as I said at the outset, 750,000 Palestinians were displaced. People left their homes for multiple reasons. They left their homes because there was fighting going on where they were living, in the villages and towns where they were living. They left their homes because they heard stories about massacres in other places and they were afraid of what was going to happen to them. And they left their homes sometimes because they were expelled from those homes by military forces. All the people who left their homes thought that they would be returning to their homes. I think, as we know, when you are faced with violence and conflict and threat to your life, people move out of the way of danger. But nobody knew that they were going to be permanently denied access to their homes. And people very often didn't go very far. They kind of went down the road. And then in the course of conflict, a border or boundary was established between where they ended up in refuge and their former homes. And that leads me to the sort of post-1948, which is they have never been allowed to return home. And that is why people have been refugees for so many years, and there have been so many generations of refugees. Lots more to say, but I think I've already gone on for a while, so I'll stop it for now and we can maybe circle back to some of the longevity questions.
Thanks, Ilana. In keeping with the theme of sort of setting the scene, Gwyn, could you tell us about UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Works Agency for Palestine refugees, how it came about, what its mission is, what sort of services it provides, where and how big are its operations, just sort of the general lay of the land in terms of UNRWA's role.
Thanks, Khaled. And thanks to Illana, because I think she's really kind of laid out the explanation quite well for why UNRWA was established, because it was following the 1948 Arab-Israeli conflict that UNRWA was established in 1950. And it was established as a subsidiary organ of the UN, and its aim was to create temporary support to the refugees at the time until a just and durable solution could be found for the Palestine refugees. So initially, UNRWA was established for a year, but 70 years later, we're still here and still providing essential services, so human development and protection services for Palestine refugees across the region. So there are Palestine refugees in Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Gaza, and the West Bank. Currently we provide assistance and protection for close to 5.7 million Palestine refugees. And those refugees are the descendants of the people who were displaced. And so the descendancy passes through the fathers, and like other refugee populations, obviously the numbers grow over the years. So just to give you a sense, a little bit of the scale of the assistance we provide, we have 5.7 million refugees registered. As I mentioned, about 500,000 children go to the UNRWA schools. So we have 709 schools, 8.4 million patient visits every year to our health centers and to our primary health care. We also provide relief and social services, social protection, and we provide assistance to a vulnerable category of people as well. And so there's 270,000 people on our social safety net program. And we also provide infrastructure and sanitation services to the 58 official camps as well. So it's quite an extensive program. And what makes UNRWA unique in terms of the other UN agencies is the fact that we deliver directly, which is very unusual. So it's a direct service provision, very much governmental in terms of the focus, in the sense that it's a school system and a health system. And that continues to provide services, again, until a political solution is found to the refugee issue.
Thank you, Gwyn. Diba, if I could ask you, Gwyn spoke about refugees all over. I want to sort of focus in with you on Gaza. You are a refugee, you live and work in Gaza. Tell us about refugees in Gaza. Where are they originally from? Where do they live now, and what kind of conditions? Where do they work? Where do they go to school?
So the majority of the population in Gaza are refugees. About 70% of the 2 million residents in Gaza are actually Palestinian refugees. Gaza itself is about 365 kilometers square, and it's one of the most dense areas in the whole world with that part of population. For the Palestinian refugees, we have 8 camps in Gaza operated by UNRWA. And on those 8 camps, one of the highly dense densely populated camps is Jabalia camp, with more than 100,000 individuals living there. However, the Palestinian refugees actually live inside and outside camps, taking consideration the space in Gaza itself. And they work and go to schools both in UNRWA and the Palestinian Authority schools. For UNRWA, they provide education from 1st to 9th grade. However, for the rest of the education, they continue with the high school and university. For the high school, it's the Palestinian Authority school, high school. And for universities, they are private universities mostly. It's good to mention that Gaza has one of the highest literacy rate, with more than 96% who are actually educated. For the rest of the question, the Palestinians living in Gaza, they are from different cities and villages from the mandated Palestine. So originally, for example, my family is from Jaffa. I have other colleagues who are actually from Ashkelon or different villages. And surprisingly, we speak different dialects. So you could, from the Arabic dialect, the Palestinian dialect, it's actually sub-dialects, and we speak differently. Even in Gaza, taking consideration that it's really small area, we in our daily communication, you can guess from one person who are they from, sometimes like normally, because it's the ones who are from the cities originally, they speak differently from the ones who used to be in villages. The conditions in Gaza is very bad, especially after the blockade, and there is a scarcity of jobs. The unemployment rate in Gaza is also one of the highest unemployment rates in the world. The people here work in civic jobs, private sector, or just their own small businesses, like to sell small things in the streets, clothes, or other type of stuff. But in the majority of the youth are actually unemployed, as there are no job opportunities or permanent job opportunities in Gaza. Thank you.
Thanks, Diba. Before I go to Gwyn, Diba, you mentioned that the unemployment is the highest, one of the highest rates in the world. What is that unemployment rate in Gaza?
It is about 48%, and it increased with the COVID-19 pandemic. There is the most recent statistics for now, it's 49.1, and that was in the second quarter of last year.
Thank you. Gwyn, I wanted to ask you, as you probably know, as I'm sure you know, UNRWA is an institution that is sort of almost constantly under attack, particularly in the US Congress. Among the many lines of attack are allegations of embezzlement. There are, they accuse UNRWA of being a facilitator for terrorism, as well as pointing out problematic issues in the textbooks used in UNRWA schools. Could you respond to some of these criticisms and maybe tell us, where you think these attacks might be coming from?
Thanks, Khalid. Yes, I think Diba and I are very, very aware of the attacks on UNRWA, as are all of our colleagues. This is something that is becoming more and more day-to-day reality for us. There's a huge number of detractors that find very specific ways of attacking or undermining the agency. Maybe I think Diba's done it a little bit, but just to put where we operate into context. I think we often talk about our education system or the curricula a little bit out of context, and I think it's important just to describe. Diba's also already touched a bit on what life is like in Gaza, but also West Bank. We have similar challenges in the sense that people living in the West Bank are also living under occupation. Regular incursions of the Israeli security forces are a day-to-day reality. In Syria, the conflict there is ongoing, and many refugees have lost their homes. So we're really operating very often in an emergency environment. And the last year, we've also, like everyone else in the world, had to deal with COVID as well. What is also important to understand is we use the Palestinian Authority curricula when we're teaching in our schools. So we're very much embedded in the environment. In Lebanon, we use the Lebanese curricula. And we don't just teach it, but we also screen that curricula. We look at human rights, we look at UN values, we look at age appropriateness and gender. And that's very much part of the work that we do to ensure that what we're teaching is really appropriate and meets our values. And very often, as part of that process, we have identified issues that we would have concern with, whether it's gender, whether it's age appropriateness for small children, or speech that we believe is inappropriate or linked to hate. And so we have a very strict protocol for how to address that. Over the last year, we've come under, the last couple of months, we've come under particular attack around our curricula. And that's linked to the fact that some organizations have identified some issues that they feel are promoting hate within our curricula. All of the issues that have been identified had already been addressed, and that was part of some of the materials that were developed during our remote learning for the 300,000 children in Gaza and the West Bank during the COVID crisis. So we had hundreds of teachers developing materials based on the PA curricula, and a very small number of examples have been identified that were problematic and that we had addressed. But we have organizations that are out there looking for those problems, identifying them and writing reports, very often that are not true, but also disregarding the continuous efforts that we're making to address them. We have a very clear approach with our teachers. So if they see issues, they don't just tear out the pages of books, but they discuss those issues with the children. They explain to the children why they're problematic. And we have continued to do that with remote learning. And as everyone could imagine, with the ongoing pressures working in Syria, in the West Bank, in Gaza, under lockdown and with remote learning, a handful of issues were identified amongst thousands and thousands of learning materials, but those things get completely blown out of proportion, and the work that we do to address them get completely disregarded. So we really do feel like there's a very strong push, and it's a lot to do with the fact that UNRWA has been very much put in the middle of a political agenda, which is linked to finding a political solution to the conflict, to the crisis. But we're a humanitarian organization, and we're being instrumentalized in a political dialogue of which we do not have a part. Our role, as it was in 1950, is to provide humanitarian and human development services to a very vulnerable population, and the political discussion and discourse has to be held outside of UNRWA in order for there to be a final agreement, a political solution found. We don't have an agenda, we don't have a mandate that would allow us to even get involved in any of those discussions, but we're constantly criticized, under attack on the curricula, on our programs. As you said, a lot of rumors about financial mismanagement. There's been absolutely no evidence of that. Our audits, the reviews, the assessments that get carried out of UNRWA all demonstrate clearly that all of that is completely unfounded. And so it's a very, very challenging environment within which to work. Thanks.
I would just add, just as an observation, the question of textbooks has come up on the Hill for years, whether it's PA textbooks or UNRWA textbooks. And there almost seems to be an effort to have a narrative that if only textbooks taught Palestinian children to love Israel, there would be peace. And that it's textbooks that teach Palestinian children to have hostility towards Israel, which is a little bit surreal when you think of a population that's living under blockade, for example, or in the West Bank, seeing parents arrested and having, settlements built around them. There is a sort of a cognitive dissonance, I think, between these positions. I'll also just add, I was in Gaza some years back and met with kids at one of the UNRWA schools, and the teacher was showing me work, something from the textbook, one of their units on coexistence and human rights. And there was a young, maybe a 14-year-old there who was giving me a speech about all the work they did. And at some point she looked up to me and she said, "This is all really good, but where are my human rights?" It was just one of those moments that just sort of took my breath away. This is a child who'd been through like 4 wars in her short life. It was very, very humbling. Diba, I want to come to you actually and talk about that a little bit, because the discussion of what UNRWA does is very politicized in Washington, and it's very disconnected from the role that UNRWA plays for Palestinian refugees. So I want you to talk again as a refugee and someone who also works at UNRWA, what UNRWA means for Palestinian refugees living in Gaza under these circumstances, with these pressures, and particularly kids.
Yes, for Palestinians living in Gaza, UNRWA means everything actually. And if you ask any person in the street, a refugee, about UNRWA, they would say it's our mother. They would say without UNRWA, we would have already died a long time ago. So for them, UNRWA means the only assurance to have basic services at least. I will go through the services of health, for example. We provide, as Ms. Gwyn mentioned, that we provide primary health services. Taking consideration, we have a high rate of diabetes and hypertension in Gaza. It's more about 40% of the population here have one of them or both. And UNRWA provides them with medication, with insulin, with necessary insulin or hypertension medications. So without this type of medication and services, people would have died. When it comes to RSSP and their food assistance, you would see a normal family. They would use what is provided to them for their daily meals. They would bake a bread from the flour. For us, bread is a basic food. Like there is no other food without bread, basically. So they will bake a bread. They will, for example, from the milk they are provided, they will make cheese and make sandwiches for their kids to go to school in the morning for a breakfast. For employment, with this high unemployment rate, UNRWA has the job creation program to at least support the refugees it's like cash for work program, and support them in supporting themselves for a short period, or even for the young graduates to get some experience. Because the challenge for the young graduates now, we have a lot of university graduates with no place to go, even for experience, and even for unpaid experience, they face a lot of difficulties. So with this kind of programs, they actually get to know how it is to work and to be able to work. For shelter rehabilitation, and especially when there were conflicts and the shelters of the people where they're living were destroyed. So it was for rebuilding their houses and moving back to where they used to live. So I think this summarizes what UNRWA means to people. It means everything, and there is no other entity they can look at that would provide them with all these kind of services. And I would say that even for education, we have the best quality of education as UNRWA compared to other institutions, especially that people trust us, trust us with their children, trust us that we will only provide them with the quality of education without any messages. So they do understand that very well. Thank you.
Can I just add something to that really rich answer, if that's okay? I mean, one of the things that I've looked at in my research as an anthropologist is precisely this question of what UNRWA, what humanitarianism in general, but UNRWA specifically, has meant to Palestinian refugees across these 5 fields. And Diba gives a really, incisive answer and window into the range of things that UNRWA does for people. But I think it's important to note for people who may be less familiar with an organization like this, that as embedded as UNRWA is in the broader UN system and in the broader humanitarian system with its commitment to humanitarian principles, it is a really distinctive organization in its longevity, right? 70 years in existence, and the range of places where it works. So you have Palestinians in 5 different fields, as Gwyn noted, and UNRWA provides services to them across all of those fields. So it's something that ties Palestinians together across these spaces. And it has educated, I mean, education is really it's done many things, but the educational work that UNRWA has provided to generations of Palestinians has just been crucial to the both individual and community life trajectory of people. And Diba, as you noted, the very high literacy rates, you have very high levels of professionalism among Palestinians in general, but refugees certainly. And UNRWA has been really crucial in helping people not only survive, but even under very difficult circumstances, thrive.
Thanks, Ilana. Since why don't we go ahead and stay with you for a moment, if we could, since we've touched on this issue of instrumentalizing UNRWA and politicizing its role. I wonder if you could comment on that, where you think maybe some of that is coming from, where this, what appears to be a very concerted and persistent campaign directed at UNRWA from different directions. If you could talk about a little bit about that, and also about another sort of line of attack that we hear with regard to UNRWA and more broadly the refugee problem, in terms of things like UNRWA is accused of actually perpetuating the refugee problem. That if UNRWA weren't there, somehow the refugee problem would go away. The fact that UNRWA has these registered refugees, including their descendants, is identified by some folks as the refugee problem itself, and that if we change that and make it disappear, particularly how refugees are defined, the idea that children and grandchildren of people who fled also qualify as refugees. Could you talk a little bit about those problems and the extent to which they may or may not be unique to the Palestinian situation?
Great, thank you for that question. Let me start by saying something briefly about my sort of read of the long-standing campaign against UNRWA, and then turn to the question of sort of refugee definition and the sort of descendants of original refugees. I mean, there is I don't know if it's ironic, but there is, in some sense, it is not surprising that UNRWA has been so targeted because it's been so important. And so for those people and forces that would like not to resolve the underlying political issues, resolve the questions that face all of the parties and the populations in the region, and come to a solution that would make UNRWA and other kinds of organizations and aid unnecessary. The fact that UNRWA has been able to do so much work to assist people makes it a target for, if we don't want to, rather than resolving the problem, let us dissolve the problem. And I think it is, of course, extremely wrong-headed to think that if you got rid of UNRWA, you would, in fact, remove refugees or the problem of unsettlement over decades. What you would remove is both the safety net and the institutional support that UNRWA provides. But I think it is the importance of UNRWA and the success of UNRWA that makes it, with all of the challenges that the agency faces, that makes it such a target. In terms of the question of the sort of definition of a Palestine refugee and the issue that comes up very frequently around the same kinds of conversations about attacks on UNRWA is why are there refugees 70 years on? If most people who are in the category of Palestine refugees were not themselves displaced in 1948, because sadly, of course, as the situation has gone on, that generation of those who were originally displaced is dying out. Right, there are still some people who remain, but by and large, the vast majority of Palestine refugees are descendants. of the original refugees. I will note that in passing on refugee status from parents to children, from those who were themselves displaced to those who are, the language of the UNHCR is derivative refugee status, is standard operating procedure among humanitarian organizations. Children who are born to people who are displaced are not typically excluded from the assistance, the aid, and the protection and the recognition as refugees. So that is not a distinctive feature of the Palestinian refugee case. What is distinctive is just how long it has gone on. But even that is a distinction of degree rather than of kind. And I think that's very important to remember, that most displacement circumstances in the world, most refugee populations experience protracted displacement. That is the norm rather than the exception. And that's tragic that that happens, but that is the case. So again, Palestinians being displaced for 70 years are at one sort of side of the spectrum, end of the spectrum in terms of the length of time that it's gone on. But that mere fact of protracted displacement does not make them exceptional. Now, just like UNRWA is distinctive, but part of a broader humanitarian terrain. Similarly, the question of the Palestine refugee is distinctive, but part of a broader universe of the sort of post-war refugee circumstance. And the post-war refugee protection regime. There is a specific definition of a Palestine refugee that emerged after 1948 to determine who was eligible for assistance. Sort of in a nutshell, someone who lived in Palestine for 2 years prior to 1948 and who, as a result of the conflict, lost their home and means of livelihood. And then, as I said, immediately, as the question of how do you operationalize those basic facts of a definition, just like with other humanitarian organizations and refugee organizations, children were immediately considered as a population that would be registered. And in terms of whether the fact of recognizing people as refugees makes the problem go on, I'm going to go back to a point that Gwyn made earlier, which is that UNRWA is not charged with resolving the refugee question. UNRWA is not charged with resolving the Palestine conflict. It doesn't have the capability to do that, and that is outside of its mandate. Its charge is to provide assistance, services, and increasingly protection to those people who are recognized as Palestine refugees. And that's the task with which it has done with nowhere near enough resources ever. And certainly now, when under great financial stress that it has set itself to, if we seek an end to the refugee problem and the existence of Palestine refugees, political actors, those of us who are not provided, the humanitarians need to push for a solution. That's how you come to an end of there being refugees, not by trying to redefine the category out of existence.
Thanks, Ilana. Diba, I want to go to you. I plan to ask you about COVID. So I want to ask you about COVID and the impact of COVID on Palestine refugees and what UNRWA has done. But before you do, just following up on what Ilana was said, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the Palestinian refugees' self-identity as refugees. There seems to sometimes be an idea, I hear it from people on Capitol Hill, that if UNRWA were disbanded, Palestinian refugees would cease to call themselves refugees, would cease to feel like they have refugee claims, and the issue would be resolved, which I see it feels a little baffling. As a Palestinian refugee, can you talk about that identity and whether it depends on UNRWA or whether it is an identity and as refugees you rely on UNRWA?
For Palestinian refugees, I would quote like nobody chooses to be a refugee. This is what all would start. But for us, we have heard from our grandparents and from our fathers a lot of stories about our original cities. So, and I was born and raised in Saudi Arabia. So I studied at the beginning my primary education in Saudi Arabia, not in Palestine, not in Gaza. And I still recognize that I am a refugee. I am Palestinian, and that I one day there should be a solution for this issue. Like one day we are hoping that there is a solution. So for us, the self-identity is not, UNRWA is helping. UNRWA is providing services, and the services that UNRWA provides can be easily linked to the sustainable development goals. So UNRWA is a unique agency that is helping in the development. The only problem in Gaza that because of the situation and because of the circumstances, we have seen the developed measures. So we are going backwards instead of going onwards, and that because of the situation, not because of UNRWA. UNRWA is trying to solve and help the Palestine to live a dignified life as much as possible. So for me, as the identity is not related to UNRWA, we understand that UNRWA is there until there is a durable and a just solution found for Palestinian refugees. This is what UNRWA is linked to. That unless there is in its mandate, unless there is a durable and just solution for Palestinian refugees, UNRWA exists. This is the understanding of all the refugees all over. Like all over the Palestine or Gaza, but UNRWA is actually helping more than should be seen as contributing to the identity, because regardless of UNRWA, people still recognize themselves as refugees. I hope this answers your question.
Yeah, no, that's exactly the question. Thank you. Gwyn, I want to come back to you, and this follows up in the same thread. You know, talking to people on the Hill or hearing the talking points that are shared on the Hill, you know, well, why did the Palestinians get their own refugee agency? Why aren't they under the UN High Commissioner for Refugee? And then the argument is effectively that if they'd been placed under the UN High Commissioner for Refugee, this would have been resolved like every other population, right? So following up on what Ilana said, that you know it's actually protracted status is the norm, it's not the exception, and talking about a little bit what the options are that UNHCR has for resolving a refugee conflict or a crisis. You know, how do you answer that? Why shouldn't UNRWA? Wouldn't the Palestinian refugee issue be resolved if it was just handed over to some other organization?
No, I mean, this is something that's been coming. You're absolutely right. It's something that's been more and more discussed, and I think you know there's a couple of issues that are forgotten. The first is, as Illana has said, that the majority of refugee situations are prolonged, and Afghanistan or Somalia are really just very clear examples of that. And generations of refugees are supported by UNHCR, just as generations of refugees have been supported by UNRWA. So that distinction in that case doesn't hold. One thing that UNHCR does have under its mandate is resettlement as an option. That's something that UNRWA is not mandated to do, so that's never been part of our mandate. Again, our mandate is very, very clear, and it's protection and service delivery for Palestine refugees until a political solution is found to the plight. So, but having said that, UNHCR does have that mandate to look at resettlement in third countries, but it's really a fraction of people who really benefit from that. So it's never a complete solution. It's never comprehensive for the communities that are affected. So at the end of the day, like Somalia, like Afghanistan, the situation in Palestine and the situation of Palestine refugees across the 5 fields of our operation, it requires a political solution. It requires a solution between parties to the conflict in order for it to be addressed. And it's a misnomer to equate the organization again, the organization is blamed for the lack of political agreement. I think where UNRWA again is different from the other UN organizations and other organizations, and I said this already, is that we provide direct delivery of really core services. And one of the real rationales for that, particularly leading up to the Oslo process, was human development, a very highly educated population, a hugely successful students in our schools will really contribute to a future, will really contribute to their own governance, their own government. People are very, the idea is that people will be very equipped and very ready and willing to take over. What UNRWA also does, and that is very, very unique, is that the vast majority, 99.9% of our colleagues are refugees themselves and are Palestinians themselves and work within the organization. So very much provide services that are embedded within the community. And that's what makes our work really unique, is that we have a community helping themselves, educating their children, and really that humanitarian development aspect of the work is, as you've already touched on, is extraordinary.
Thanks, Gwyn. Ilana, I wanted to turn to you if we could. We've heard about quite a lot about how UNRWA is working to provide these services to the Palestine refugees, whether in the occupied territories or in neighboring Arab states, and that this is a very sort of pressing humanitarian concern, and it's only become more so, just given the protracted nature of the problem and of course things like the COVID pandemic. But we've also talked about how there needs to be this political resolution. So I'm wondering, how do we balance between these two? And if I could maybe add a bit more context, one of the things that I've always been struck by is that, groups like UNRWA in the past did not always enjoy support from the Palestinians themselves. I mean, there was a time, particularly early on, when Palestinians and Arab states saw UNRWA as providing this humanitarian support as a way to avoid a political resolution of the problem, because you could just kind of keep throwing money at the problem. So it's sort of bizarre in the sense that, if anything, it's sort of the opposite of what UNRWA was accused of, right? So I'm wondering, how do we balance between these two dynamics? How do we get to a political resolution? Is that even possible?
All right, I'll hold off on the last part of your question to the end, see if I can figure out how we get to a political solution. But actually, let me start by speaking to one of the things you mentioned about the sort of complicated feelings that Palestinians themselves have about UNRWA. And one of the things that is striking, I think, to any of us who spends time in the Middle East and Palestine, is how much the conversation, often the political conversation, certainly the conversation far away, tries to either simplify complexity or claim complexity as a way of not doing anything. And the problem with the kind of simplification is that it demands of people, or it supposes of people, that they have one single opinion and one viewpoint about anything that's going on in their lives. And UNRWA is a great example. Again, I did research partly about this question across the Middle East, and one of the things that I talked to Palestinians in Lebanon, in the West Bank, in Gaza, and Jordan was about how they felt about UNRWA. And you can see this also in an archival record. And the answer is that they feel many different ways about UNRWA, because UNRWA has meant many different things. So we've talked a lot already about the absolute centrality of UNRWA in providing not just emergency services, but education, healthcare, kind of institution, community building services that support people's ability to not just survive, but imagine a life that they want for themselves. So it's crucial in that way, kind of providing, in the absence of a Palestinian state, state-like services at the administrative level. And at the same time, as you gestured to, Khaled, people worry a great deal that an attention to the humanitarian problem that Palestinians face gets in the way of political resolution, that it, both in a kind of cynical way that people say, well, people, they would say, we'll give you flowers so that you don't demand your political rights. But also in the kind of just effect of where are you turning your energy, right? If we think of the Palestinian question as a humanitarian question, are we not thinking of it as a political matter that needs to be resolved? And so in terms of, the question of how do Palestinians feel about UNRWA, they feel all those things and they see all of those things. And, so the existence of ongoing humanitarian aid is seen as a problem. The existence of ongoing humanitarian aid is seen as a recognition of international involvement in and responsibility for a resolution. So all of those things at once. And this also gestures to, I think, one of the kind of central paradoxes of humanitarian work in general, that it is always, in some sense, inadequate to the task, right? The mandate of humanitarian action is to help keep people alive, to alleviate suffering, but not to solve the problems that have led to people being at risk and to facing suffering. There, a former head of Doctors Without Borders sort of famously quipped about humanitarianism that there are no humanitarian solutions to humanitarian problems. And so that's the context in which humanitarian aid is delivered, right? It cannot solve the problem, which doesn't mean that it's not necessary. So in some sense, I think what, policymakers need to do is walk and chew gum at the same time, right? Both recognize the need, and you don't have to look very hard or dig too deeply to see just how extensive and growing in the need of Palestinian refugees is, and in fact that our support for agencies like UNRWA, and when I say our right now, I mean the United States, U.S. citizens. Our support is not just an act of charity to somebody over there, but it is in part our responsibility because we are directly involved in the circumstances in which people live. But providing that aid and support as necessary as it is does not take the place of working in multiple ways to try to achieve a political resolution. I mean, this is from the very beginning of the years after 1948. We've been talking about UNRWA, but UNRWA, even at an international level, was only meant to be kind of one part of an international response to the question of Palestine. UNRWA was to provide humanitarian assistance, and there was another UN agency, the UN Conciliation Commission for Palestine, that was meant to address underlying political issues, questions of property, questions of resolution, and it was never able to accomplish that. And we've had many, sort of just layers of what have proved to be, unfortunately, ineffectual or, I'll leave it there, efforts to get to a resolution. So I realize I've come to, I think, the end of my answer without telling you how we get to a political resolution, except to say that the provision of humanitarian aid, as vital as it is given the circumstances, cannot substitute for the work of trying to get to a political resolution.
Thanks, Ilana. And I want to come to Gwyn and really sort of following up on Ilana's response. I mean, the challenge of walking and chewing gum when it comes to the Palestinians is that, even the mere action of taking a step on humanitarian work is now so politicized. It's almost like, I don't want to say deliberate, but it's as if the goal has been to make it so you use it. Anyone who wants to engage here has to use up all their political capital just on trying to get aid to UNRWA. There's nothing left to work on the chewing gum part. So with that as sort of the context, so after 70 years now, what are UNRWA's biggest challenges? the evolution from the challenge of trying to build capacity to deal with this conflict to sustaining capacity as it became to sustain conflict. Here we are today, and I mean, we read constantly about UNRWA running out of money. That's a perpetual problem. I mean, why is it always running out of money? Why, and what is it like to run this kind of operation, which is at the core of people's basic human needs, right? On basically a shoestring budget all the time and constantly on the edge of having to shut down.
So one of the most challenging aspects of that is that we do have extraordinary programs, and those programs are very successful, and you know, we win awards for our education program, and our students, you know, are a real testament to that and the achievements that they have. But the challenge is we are unable to move beyond a budget that was set 3 or 4 years ago, and in terms, we can't even take into account inflation, and we're just really running on the very basic amount of money that we need just to keep our services running. So we're unable to invest at all in any of our infrastructure or our programs beyond just keeping things ticking over. And this year, again, it looks like we may not even be able to do that, even with a very hopeful forecast of our revenue this year. Looks like we'll be about $200 million short against our core program budget of about 800 million. So basically by September, October this year, I don't know if I can keep the schools open in the West Bank. I don't know if we can maintain the health program. I don't know if I'll be able to make the social assistance payments to the most vulnerable families. We're constantly questioning whether or not we'll be able to pay our teachers and our sanitation laborers and just the frontline staff who are delivering these services. So every month, you know, again in February, we're a few days late with the salaries because we got the last $4 million in that we needed to make payroll, 2 days late. So it's just a constant juggling and squeezing. We do things like put newly recruited teachers, for example. They have a different contract modality. They work on a daily paid basis because we can't put them on a contract. We're unable to repair our cars to get people from A to B. Just really, really basic things that you really need to keep things going. I don't have enough for our internet bill payments past September. So how you do remote learning for children at school. I mean, I can go on and on and on, but it really takes its toll because we're working in a very difficult environment. We're working under occupation. We're seeing increases in settler violence, increases in home demolitions. We're also working in a very challenging political environment at the moment. It's increasingly tense because of the upcoming Palestinian elections. COVID is on the rise again. So we're back into lockdown. The schools are closed again. We're going back to remote learning. So it's very, very tense. And then it's really difficult to keep people motivated, to keep the teachers motivated to show up, to engage with the children. And it's incredibly stressful, and people are very, very anxious about the future. They don't know what's going to happen next month or in 3 months. So we're constantly just running on empty, you know, just trying to keep things going, and then trying to fight off these attacks that are becoming more and more tough, more and more virulent, and very unfair. And so we go from emergency to emergency and financial crisis to financial crisis. And I spend my time trying to raise money and talking about our financial deficit. And what I would really like to do is talk about the extraordinary work that we're doing on the ground. You know, our doctors who are referring COVID patients to the Ministry of Health, who've done an extraordinary job on mitigating the impacts of the pandemic, who are doing home delivery of medicine, who we have a hotline for outreach to the community to try and minimize some of the social impact, to try and mitigate gender-based violence. So there's an extraordinary amount of work, but we just run from financial crisis to financial crisis. So it's extraordinarily challenging.
Thanks Gwyn. I'm always struck at this, by this question as it relates to the UNRWA's ongoing financial struggles, particularly since, a lot of these changes are so recent. Up until the Trump era, the United States was the largest single donor to UNRWA. And, we've long since forgotten the context for that and the reasons behind that. But one of the reasons for that is because in 1948, the United States felt a disproportionate amount of responsibility for the creation of the Palestinian refugee crisis. And it was the one thing that Congress and the White House agreed on, that Republicans and Democrats over the years, was that the United States had this very important role to play. And it's just sort of striking how much attitudes have changed, particularly in recent years. So thanks for that context. Diba, I wanted to ask you again, since you're in Gaza, and Gaza, being a place that has been subjected to blockade and numerous military offensives, tell us a little bit about what that experience is like, particularly in terms of mental health. I remember a couple years ago, I participated in an UNRWA event on Capitol Hill that was focusing attention on mental health issues, particularly in Gaza and for children. How do Palestinians in Gaza cope, and what role does UNRWA play in helping them cope with these very difficult circumstances?
Thank you for that question. Considering the difficult circumstances in which Palestinians in Gaza live, mental health issues are exaggerating. And especially that there are many reports say that almost the majority of Palestinians need actually mental health services with lack of access to these kind of services. In UNRWA, and especially for children, we do have counselors in our schools. So for the counselors, they do provide children with one-to-one sessions, counseling sessions, group sessions, and they do extracurricular activities with the kids in the beginning of before the classroom starts or before the end of the day. So they try to support the children as much as they can. During COVID and with the remote modality, they supported the counselors inside the schools. They supported children, the parents of the children, through WhatsApp messages or calling them, providing psychosocial services through mobile phones, through WhatsApp or just direct calls. And they supported the teachers themselves, who actually also needed support. So beside that, we have also in our health centers counselors who also provided through the helplines counseling sessions to individuals who requested them. So for psychosocial or mental health is really very important. For UNRWA, we provide the basics. So for extra service or for specialized services, we do refer them. There is a very well-known organizations and trusted organizations. So for cases that needs specialized services, they are referred. And also through our social workers, because of the situation in Gaza, the level of violence, like I'm talking about gender-based violence or child violence, which are detected sometimes in schools. The kids also are dealt by case managers through the counselor or the social workers we have, and they receive full services.
Thanks. It's I know UNRWA well, and I've written about this, and I visit on the ground, and I am constantly amazed at the breadth of the activities, and it's really quite remarkable, particularly considering what we've already talked about, which is the limited resources. Gwyn, I don't know if this is something you're comfortable speculating on, but if you could talk a little bit about what it meant to UNRWA when the US cut off its funding. as its formerly largest donor. And I guess I'm curious whether UNRWA is optimistic that the US will return to supporting UNRWA under the Biden administration, and what it would mean if it does.
No, when the US funding was cut, it was really dramatic because it was over 30% of our budget. So it was over 300 million US dollars were cut from our budget. So it was, when we found, I don't think I'll ever forget it, when we found out, it was really, really frightening because we just didn't know how we were going to cope that year. It came very, very unexpectedly. We anticipated there might be a reduction, but it was very dramatic. And so it had a huge impact. And I think in 2018, there was a huge solidarity from other countries, and we were able to fundraise to make up the loss that year. But ever since, we haven't been able to reach the same level of solidarity or support. So it really has left a longer term gap in the budget. You know, it just, we had to go, we've been in austerity measures ever since. So we put in place savings across all of the budget line. We reduced some of our programs. But like, for example, in the West Bank, just to give you one of many examples, we had a mental health program for Bedouin communities. There's a lot of Palestine refugees who were displaced that are part of the Bedouin community. We had to stop those. We also lost 150 staff members who were working on a job creation program across the West Bank. So each of the fields had a really challenge in order to really, you know, shrink down and really focus in on the core and just look at how whatever cost saving measures we could put in place. So all of those cost saving measures are still in place. We've never really recovered. We are hopeful that the US will re-engage. And there's a lot of discussion at the moment, and we're not really sure if and when that will happen, and to what extent that re-engagement will be and what it will look like. But I think, you know, Khaled has already touched on it. The US has really been an important part of UNRWA, not just in terms of funding, but also the political, you know, discussions outside of UNRWA around, you know, the political solution and understanding the importance of keeping services available for Palestinians and the humanitarian side, but also the development side. So that partnership is above and beyond the financial, and that was also a loss. And so, you know, above and beyond funding, that will be a really, we're looking forward to having that partnership back, and some of the advocacy work linked to our protection work, you know, help with, you know, raising issues of concern will be really, really important. So fingers crossed.
I join you in crossing my fingers on that.
Can I just say, are you?
Yep. No, go ahead.
I was just going to say one brief thing, that when Gwyn was talking earlier about having to change the circumstances of teachers hire from contract to daily pay, that it's just another, you know, it's not small for people, but kind of at the ground level highlights the implications of these kinds of funding cuts. So not only are services cut and constrained and you can't do certain things, but, you know, employment with UNRWA was a major tool of social mobility for Palestinians over generations. So you have many people whose parents, grandparents were UNRWA teachers who went on to, you know, go from there to get their own university education to very significant careers that were in some sense enabled by stable employment through UNRWA, which was important work for the community. So just the kind of cascading effects of this constriction of what UNRWA is able to do. It's not just as important as it is in the constriction of direct services, but in the kind of transgenerational broad community effects of the restriction of this important institution.
Yeah, and I would add to that, we did a webinar back at the beginning of COVID looking at UNRWA and Gaza. And one of the things that came up, which I had never thought about, was the sort of second and third degree effects of cutting of aid and loss of employment, particularly loss of employment, where you in a sense have a a full-time employee of UNRWA supporting almost an entire ecosystem of family that sort of depend on that to trickle down, so that as people were losing jobs, as funds were cut off because of the US, we actually had this many degrees of poverty, more than just simply the breadwinner losing their salary. Okay, we're running out of time. I want to ask Ilana one more, maybe it's sort of provocative question. It's something that I've looked at and I've written about, which is one of the common arguments you hear on the Hill as well, which is Palestinian refugees aren't the real refugees in the Middle East. We should be worrying about the real refugees are the Jews who were kicked out of their homes or forced to leave or otherwise not fully voluntarily left homes in Arab lands. And their claims in terms of financial claims against Arab states dwarf those of the Palestinian refugees. And fine, if you're going to consider both refugee populations, then they cancel each other out. And it's only because there's anti-Semitism or anti-Israel feeling that we don't notice what should be the primary concern, which is the Jewish refugees from Arab lands. Can you talk about that for 3 minutes?
Okay, you might be able to talk about it better than I, but I'll say, I mean, it's a kind of false equivalency and whataboutism that just tries to avoid the question. I mean, the idea that Palestinians, the reality of their need, their claims, their experience needs to be filtered through, some kind of weight of any other experience is just, it doesn't actually make any sense. Right? First of all, you can have more than one actual refugee population, but also the Palestinian needs, claims, and demand for and insistence upon resolution is distinctive from whatever other claims another population may have against Arab states. You can't simply sort of have this view things as a mass of everybody's an Arab. Palestinians are Arabs, Iraqis are Arabs, and therefore there is no need to address this population if you can kind of weight it out against some other government somewhere else. So the circumstances of Jews' departure from Iraq is, to put it quite bluntly, not on the Palestinians' back, and their circumstances need to be addressed independently. Now, I think there is a lot to be said for trying to think regionally and multilaterally about the circumstances that face many parties in the Middle East. That is over the past number of years, policymaking has kind of moved away from that approach and has sought to make single agreements with countries to try to seemingly undercut the ability of Palestinians to have a voice in kind of claim making. But back to something that I said earlier, you can't dissolve, you need to resolve the problem. So kind of misdirection, it actually, I mean, it won't achieve the ends that people hope for.
Thank you, Ilana. So we're just about out of time now. So on behalf of the Foundation for Middle East Peace and the Middle East Institute, I want to thank our participants, Diba, Gwyn, and Ilana, for a really rich and enlightening conversation. And thanks to all of you who joined, particularly those who submitted questions. We hope you'll join us again for our next session next Friday at this same time, where the focus is going to be on free speech and the right to protest as it relates to Israel and Palestine. Our panelists next week will be Dima Khalidi from Palestine Legal, Yusuf Munayir, a Palestinian American scholar, and Hadar Suskin from Americans for Peace Now. And once again, thank you all, and we hope to see you again next week.
Thanks, everybody.